The front door stuck to the frame when I pushed it open. That wasn't unusual. The house had done that every summer since I was 16. What felt unusual was the silence, not actual silence. I could hear laughter drifting in from the backyard. Crystal glasses clinked together. Someone was telling a story loud enough to impress people who already wanted to be impressed. A string quartet played somewhere near the patio. But inside the house, something felt wrong. I stood in the entryway for a second longer than I should have. The EMDR sessions at the Richmond VA had taken nearly 2 hours. Dr. Patel had pushed harder than usual. We'd spent most of the afternoon digging through memories I preferred to keep buried under concrete and paperwork. By the time I got home, my head felt like somebody had unplugged half the circuits and left the rest sparking. I wasn't interested in whatever political circus my mother had organized. I wasn't interested in donors. I wasn't interested in campaign speeches. I wanted Scout. That's it. Just Scout. My Belgian Malinois had a habit of meeting me at the top of the stairs every time I came home. 12 years of military work had trained him to read me better than most humans ever could. On difficult therapy days, he'd usually reach me before I even made it to my room. His nose would press against my hand. His tail would give one slow wag. Then my breathing would settle down without either of us making a big deal about it. Simple, reliable, honest. Things my family had never been particularly good at. I climbed the stairs, passing framed family photos that looked more expensive than happy. My mother's campaign consultant had probably picked half of them. Every picture showed success. None showed reality. I reached my bedroom door and pushed it open. The room was empty. I stopped. Scout's dog bed sat beside the window. His water bowl was half full. His favorite red tug toy lay exactly where he'd left it that morning. But Scout wasn't there. I frowned and looked around again. Sometimes he'd squeeze himself under the desk when thunderstorms rolled through. Sometimes he'd curl up behind the armchair. Nothing. Scout? My voice sounded strange. Too loud. No answer. I stepped farther inside. The leash hook beside the closet was empty. My stomach tightened. Scout never took his leash off the hook. Because dogs don't do that. People do. I checked the bathroom. Nothing. I checked the guest room across the hall. Nothing. A cold sensation slid down my spine. Not fear. Not yet. Something worse. The beginning of fear. The kind that arrives quietly. The kind that asks questions before it starts screaming. I pulled out my phone. No messages. No calls. No explanation. Downstairs, somebody laughed hard enough to snort. The crowd outside sounded larger than I expected. My mother had apparently gone all in on this event. A week earlier, she'd bragged that more than 80 donors had RSVP'd. Apparently, saving veterans was an excellent campaign slogan. Actually, listening to one wasn't nearly as popular. I moved back to the hallway. Scout, still nothing. My pulse picked up. I hated that. PTSD turns your body into an unreliable narrator. Sometimes a dropped fork feels like incoming artillery. Sometimes a crowded room feels like a threat assessment. Sometimes your own heartbeat becomes the loudest sound in existence. I forced myself to breathe. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Dr. Patel's voice echoed in my head. Stay present, stay grounded, observe, don't predict. Easier said than done. I walked downstairs. The smell of catered food drifted through the kitchen. Prime rib, garlic, mashed potatoes, something expensive involving crab. The catering invoice had accidentally been left on the counter 2 days earlier. I remembered the total because numbers stick in my head. 14,862.710. Apparently, support veterans required a seafood tower. Who knew? I stepped toward the back patio. The crowd came into view. Women in designer dresses, men in tailored jackets, local business owners, developers, political consultants, people holding champagne glasses while discussing community values. My favorite genre of fiction. Near the center of the crowd stood my mother. Evelyn Thorne looked like she'd been preparing for this moment her entire life. Perfect hair, perfect smile, perfect posture. She laughed at something a donor said and touched his arm at exactly the right moment. A campaign ad disguised as a human being. I scanned the yard. No Scout. My breathing became shallower. I checked near the shade tents. Nothing. I checked beside the outdoor bar. Nothing. A few guests noticed me. Several offered polite smiles. One older man immediately extended his hand. Thank you for your service. I shook it automatically. The phrase had become background noise years ago. Most people meant well. Some treated it like a coupon they handed out before returning to their own lives. I kept moving. No Scout, no leash, no explanation. Then something caught my attention. A younger volunteer carrying folding chairs crossed the patio. As he passed me, he hesitated. His eyes flicked toward the far end of the property, just for a second. Then he looked away, too fast, too nervous. My training kicked in before my emotions did. People reveal things when they think nobody is watching. And that kid had just revealed something. I followed his line of sight, beyond the manicured lawn, past the flower beds, past the decorative fencing, toward the detached tool garage sitting near the back corner of the property. The same garage nobody ever used unless they had to. A strange feeling settled into my chest, cold, heavy, certain. I started walking. Because suddenly I wasn't wondering where Scout was anymore. I was terrified, I already knew. I cut across the lawn before my brain could talk me out of what my instincts were already telling me. The volunteer had disappeared back into the crowd, but I couldn't shake the look on his face. It wasn't guilt, exactly. It was the look people get when they've seen something wrong and decided it wasn't their problem. I knew that look. The military teaches you to notice details. PTSD makes sure you never stop. As I moved through the gala, guests kept stepping into my path. A woman wearing a pearl necklace smiled at me. "Thank you for your service." I nodded without slowing down. 10 feet later, another donor did the same thing. Then another. Then another. Apparently, I had become the evening's patriotic decoration. Nobody actually wanted a conversation. Nobody asked what unit I served with. Nobody asked how I was doing. Nobody asked why I looked like I was searching for something. They just wanted the handshake, the photo, the feeling. The same way people thank firefighters while complaining about taxes. I kept moving. My dress uniform suddenly felt heavier than usual. Not because of the medals, because of why I was wearing it. The uniform hadn't been my idea. 3 days earlier, my mother had stood in the kitchen holding her phone and speaking like she was giving instructions to a caterer. "Make sure you wear your dress blues." I had looked up from Scout's feeding bowl. Why? Because people respect military service. I almost laughed. Evelyn Thorne had spent 12 years treating my military career like an unfortunate tattoo. Now suddenly it was useful. Funny how that worked. When I enlisted at 21, she called it a phase. When I deployed overseas, she told friends I was doing government work. When I came home with PTSD, she acted like I had personally inconvenienced her social calendar. But now she was running for city council. Now military service was marketable. Now I was valuable, at least for photographs. Scout wasn't. That part had become obvious almost immediately. 2 weeks earlier, a campaign volunteer had asked if Scout could stay inside during an event, because his presence might make donors uncomfortable. The volunteer looked embarrassed even saying it. I told him Scout was a federally protected service dog. The conversation ended there, at least officially. As I passed another cluster of guests, I spotted Julian near the outdoor bar. My older brother stood surrounded by 3 developers and a commercial banker. His suit probably cost more than my first pickup truck. Julian had perfected the art of looking successful. He laughed at the right volume, nodded at the right moments, touched people's shoulders when he wanted them to feel important. Every interaction looked rehearsed. The scary part was how well it worked. One of the developers said something, and the entire group laughed. Julian caught sight of me for half a second. His smile tightened. Then he immediately looked away. That got my attention. Most people would have waved. Julian acted like eye contact carried legal liability. Interesting. I changed direction toward him. Before I could reach the group, another donor stepped in front of me. An older man holding a champagne flute extended his hand. "Master Sergeant Thorne, right?" I shook it automatically. "Yes, sir. My grandson wants to join the army." I forced a smile. Good for him. He'll probably never see combat these days. I stared at him. The statement was so spectacularly uninformed that my brain needed a second to process it. Then I remembered Dr. Patel's favorite advice. Not every battle deserves ammunition. I nodded politely and continued walking. Behind me, the man immediately started talking about golf. Of course he did. When I looked back toward Julian, he was already moving deeper into the crowd, avoiding me. Definitely avoiding me. A small knot formed in my stomach. Julian wasn't a brave man. He wasn't cruel in dramatic ways. He preferred convenient cruelty, the kind that arrives wearing a smile, the kind that lets other people suffer while keeping its own hands clean. Growing up, if something broke, I got blamed. If something succeeded, Julian got praised. The pattern became so predictable that eventually I stopped being surprised. Invisible children learn to save energy. The problem is that people eventually start believing you're invisible. I scanned the crowd again. No Scout, no leash, no sign of him anywhere. The music continued playing. Servers carried trays of appetizers. A photographer moved between guests collecting campaign images. Everything looked perfect, too perfect. My pulse picked up another notch. Hypervigilance isn't some Hollywood superpower, it's exhausting. Your brain starts processing everything. Who looks nervous? Who avoids eye contact? Who keeps glancing toward a specific location? Who knows something, who doesn't? The farther I walked across the property, the more pieces started fitting together. The volunteer's nervous glance, Julian avoiding me, Scout disappearing without explanation, and one simple fact. Scout never wandered off, ever. 12 years of training doesn't just disappear. If Scout wasn't beside me, someone had put him somewhere. The realization landed hard, not because it surprised me, because it didn't. Deep down, I already knew my family viewed Scout the same way they viewed me. As a problem when convenient, as an asset when useful, as a living being never. A burst of applause erupted near the patio stage. My mother had climbed onto the platform. She stood beneath a campaign banner that read, Community, Honor, Surface. I nearly laughed. The irony could have powered the entire neighborhood. Evelyn raised a microphone and began thanking supporters. The crowd turned toward her. I kept walking in the opposite direction. Toward the edge of the property, toward the detached garage, toward the growing certainty that whatever I was about to find wasn't an accident. The farther I got from the crowd, the quieter everything became. The string quartet faded. The applause disappeared. The garage sat alone near the fence line. And when I finally got closest enough to see it clearly, one detail stopped me cold. A heavy deadbolt was locked across the outside of the door. I stopped walking. For a second, my brain refused to process what I was seeing. Nobody locked a storage garage from the outside during a party. Nobody locked an empty building and then left it sitting in 100-degree heat. Unless they wanted something trapped inside. The knot in my stomach tightened. Scout? I called his name louder this time. Nothing. No bark, no movement, no scratching, nothing. The silence hit harder than any answer could have. I moved closer and grabbed the door handle, locked. I rattled it hard enough to shake the frame. Still nothing. My pulse started hammering. The small garage window sat several feet to the right of the door. The glass was covered with years of dirt, pollen, and dust from lawn equipment. I stepped toward it. At first, all I could see was darkness. Then my eyes adjusted, and everything inside me stopped. Scout was lying on the concrete floor. He wasn't sleeping. He wasn't resting. He was struggling. His chest rose and fell in rapid, desperate bursts. Thick strands of saliva hung from his mouth. His tongue was extended far beyond normal panting. His eyes looked unfocused, disoriented. Wrong. A service dog handler learns to recognize heat distress almost immediately. I'd seen military working dogs collapse during training exercises overseas. I knew exactly what I was looking at, and I knew how little time I had. Scout. His ears twitched. Barely. That tiny reaction scared me more than if he'd ignored me completely. He should have been standing. He should have been charging toward my voice. Instead, he could barely lift his head. My gaze dropped to the floor beneath him. The concrete around the door was covered with scratch marks. Deep ones. Several streaks of dried blood stained the surface. His front paws were torn open from trying to dig his way out. Something cold washed through me. Not panic. Not yet. Training. Years of military training taking control before emotion could interfere. Assess, act, move. The door wasn't opening. Finding a key would take too long. Arguing with somebody would take too long. Heatstroke doesn't care about explanations. I spun toward the house. The sound of the string quartet drifted across the property. Violins, cello, polite applause. 50 yards away, wealthy donors were sipping champagne and discussing community leadership. 50 yards away, my dog was cooking alive in a garage. The contrast was so absurd it almost felt like a bad movie. Except it wasn't. Scout tried to push himself up. His legs slipped underneath him. That ended any debate. I reached for the tactical flashlight clipped to my belt. The aluminum body weighed just over 2 pounds, solid enough to break glass. The first strike shattered the corner of the window. The second strike blew out most of the remaining pane. Glass exploded inward. The noise echoed across the yard. Good. Let them hear it. I knocked away the remaining shards with the flashlight and shoved my arm through the opening. The wooden framing inside blocked most of the space. Come on. I grabbed the frame and pulled. Nothing. The wood groaned. I planted my boots and pulled harder. Years of lifting military equipment and handling 70-pound working dogs finally became useful in a suburban backyard. The frame cracked, then snapped. Splinters tore into my palms. I barely noticed. The opening widened enough for me to climb through. Hot air slammed into me immediately. It felt like opening an oven. The garage had no ventilation, no fan, no open windows, no airflow. The temperature inside had to be well over 100 degrees. The smell hit next: dust, motor oil, old fertilizer, and overheated dog. I dropped to one knee beside Scout. His breathing sounded terrible, fast, shallow, uncontrolled. I slipped one hand under his neck. "Hey, buddy." His eyes finally focused. Just a little, enough to recognize me. His tail moved once, a weak tap against the floor. That nearly broke me. This dog had pulled me through nightmares, pulled me through panic attacks, pulled me through days when getting out of bed felt harder than deployment. And even now, barely conscious, he was trying to comfort me. Dogs are strange that way. Humans can spend years calculating what they might get from you. A good dog just shows up. I checked his gums, dry. I touched his ears, burning hot. Every sign pointed in the same direction. Get him out now. I slid both arms underneath him. Scout weighed around 70 pounds, but adrenaline made him feel lighter. I lifted him against my chest and turned toward the broken window. The climb out was awkward. One arm supporting the dog, one arm bracing against the frame, glass crunching beneath my boots. My hand slipped twice because of blood and sweat. The third attempt got us through. The second we reached fresh air, Scout sucked in a deeper breath. Not normal, not recovered, but better, a start. I carried him across the grass towards a shaded area near the fence. The music was still playing. The gala was still happening. Servers were still carrying trays. People were still laughing. Nobody had any idea what had just happened 20 yards away. Or maybe some of them did. Maybe they simply hadn't cared enough to check. I laid Scout down beneath the shade of an oak tree and pulled out my phone. My fingers shook as I searched for the nearest emergency veterinary hospital. Then I noticed something attached to Scout's collar. A small white plastic zip tie. The kind people use to secure electrical cords. The kind that absolutely did not belong there. I stared at it. Then I followed the tie down to a short length of rope still hanging from his collar. A rope that had clearly been cut. Someone hadn't just put Scout in the garage. Someone had tied him there. And suddenly this stopped looking like neglect. It started looking intentional. I clipped the broken rope from his collar and shoved it into my pocket. Evidence. 12 years around military investigations had taught me one useful lesson thus. People lie. Physical evidence usually doesn't. Scout tried to stand again. His legs wobbled. I immediately dropped beside him. Easy. His breathing was still too fast. The nearest emergency veterinary clinic was 23 minutes away according to my phone. 23 minutes felt like a year. I slipped one arm beneath his chest and another beneath his hind legs. The second I lifted him, he rested his head against my shoulder. Trust is a strange thing. You spend years earning it. One selfish decision can destroy it. I carried him toward the house. Nobody stopped me. Nobody even noticed. A campaign volunteer hurried past, carrying a tray of drinks. A local developer was busy laughing at his own joke. A photographer snapped pictures of smiling donors near the stage. The entire event continued as if a decorated military working dog hadn't nearly died 50 yards away. I pushed through the back door and entered the kitchen. The air conditioning felt cold against my skin. I laid Scout on the tile floor beside the large kitchen island. His sides continued rising and falling rapidly. Not as bad as before, still bad. I grabbed several dish towels from a drawer, then I soaked them with cool water, not ice water. Every military canine handler learns that mistake early. Cooling a heat-injured dog too aggressively can create new problems. Slow, controlled, steady. I placed the wet towels across his paws, chest, and neck. Good boy. His ears twitched, the first real response I'd seen in nearly 15 minutes. A tiny victory. My hands started stinging. I looked down. Blood ran across my knuckles and dripped onto the kitchen floor. Glass cuts. I hadn't even noticed them. Adrenaline is funny that way. It sends you the bill later. I reached for another towel and wrapped it loosely around my right hand. At that exact moment, the kitchen door burst open. Evelyn stormed inside. The smile she'd been wearing outside disappeared instantly. It was awesomely impressive. Most people need time to switch personalities. My mother could do it between doorways. Her eyes landed on the broken glass cuts, then Scout, then the bloody towels, then me. For one hopeful second, I thought she might ask if we were okay. Instead, she looked furious, not worried, not frightened, furious. What the hell happened to the garage window? There it was, the first question, and somehow it wasn't about the dog. I stared at her, she stared back. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, I said, "Scout almost died." She folded her arms. That's not what I asked. I took a slow breath. Why was he locked in the garage? Her expression barely changed. No guilt, no embarrassment. Nothing. She looked irritated, the same way someone might react after discovering a coffee stain on a tablecloth. Ethan Mercer was uncomfortable. I blinked. Ethan who? My investor. The answer came immediately, as if it explained everything. As if I should have already understood. She shook her head. Julian's biggest investor, the one helping with the Ridgeway Commons project. I remembered the name. A commercial development deal worth millions. Retail space, luxury apartments. Several zoning approvals still pending. Julian had been obsessing over it for months. I looked down at Scout, then back at her. So you locked him in a garage? He has a phobia of large dogs. The casual way she said it made my stomach turn. A phobia. Yes, a phobia. That's what I said. I laughed. Actually laughed, not because anything was funny, because my brain needed a second to process how insane the conversation had become. Scout is a service dog. He intimidates people. He nearly died. He ruined the atmosphere. I stared at her. The fact that she genuinely believed her own argument somehow made it worse. Outside, applause erupted from the patio. Apparently somebody had finished another speech. Inside the kitchen, my mother was defending the attempted cooking of a military working dog. America is a fascinating country. I stood up. Slowly, carefully. My head suddenly felt very clear. I'm taking him to a veterinarian. Evelyn's eyes narrowed. Right now? Yes, you can't leave. I honestly thought I'd misheard her. What? You heard me. I shook my head. No. We're done here. I reached for Scout's leash, hanging beside the mudroom door. My mother stepped directly into my path, not dramatically, not aggressively, just enough to block the exit. The movement felt practiced. Like she'd been controlling people this way her entire life. Maybe she had. Move. No. I stared at her. The room became very quiet. Even the music outside seemed distant. Evelyn. She hated when I used her first name. Move. Her jaw tightened. You have no choice but to walk back out there. I almost laughed again. She continued. You smile. Silence. You shake hands. Silence. You stand beside me for photographs. Silence. Or Julian loses those zoning permits and my campaign is finished. There it was. The truth. Not concern, not family, not even money. Everything always came back to image. I looked at Scout lying on the floor, then at the blood drying on my hands, then back at my mother. No. One word. Nothing more. Just no. The answer hit her harder than screaming ever could. Her face changed instantly. Years of public charm vanished. The mask slipped, and underneath it was pure anger. Before I could react, her hand flew across the space between us. Crack. The slap landed hard against my cheek. The sound echoed through the kitchen. My head turned slightly from the impact. The sting arrived a second later. Sharp. Hot. Surprisingly familiar. Not because she'd hit me before, because disappointment always hurts in exactly the same place. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then she pointed toward Scout. Toward the dog who had saved lives overseas. Toward the dog bleeding on her kitchen floor. And she hissed through clenched teeth. You will not ruin this family's future, because of a mutt. The words hung in the kitchen long after she finished speaking. I didn't touch my face. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't step forward. I didn't step back. The sting in my cheek was real, but it felt strangely unimportant compared to everything else that had happened during the last 30 minutes. Scout nearly dying, the garage, the rope, the blood on his paws, the look in my mother's eyes when she defended all of it. Somewhere along the way, something inside me became very quiet, not numb, not defeated, just quiet. The kind of quiet that arrives when you finally stopped expecting someone to become the person they should have been years ago. The kitchen door opened again. Julian walked in, perfect timing. He looked from my face to our mother, then down to Scout, then immediately toward the floor. Interesting. He already knew, maybe not every detail, but enough. People don't avoid eye contact unless they're afraid of what they might see there. For several seconds, nobody said anything. The silence became uncomfortable, at least for them. I found it oddly peaceful. 35 years of being Evelyn Thorne's daughter had taught me something valuable. Every argument with her followed the same script. You defended yourself. She escalated. You explained. She redirected. You got emotional. She won. Not because she was right. Because she was willing to stay in the fight longer than anyone else. The only way to win was not to play. I looked at Julian. Did you know? His shoulders shifted slightly. That was answer enough. Still, I waited. Finally, he sighed. Ethan gets nervous around dogs. I stared at. The response was so small compared to the damage it had caused. Not anger, not concern, not guilt, just logistics. A business problem. An investor issue. A scheduling inconvenience. I nodded slowly. Did you know she locked him in a 100-degree garage? Julian looked away again. There it was. The second answer. You can learn a lot from what people refuse to say. Scout lifted his head. The movement immediately pulled my attention away from both of them. I knelt beside him. His breathing had improved slightly. Not much. Enough. I reached for a clean towel from the counter. Then another. The cuts on my hands had started bleeding again. Tiny drops landed on the white tile floor. I wrapped the towel around my right hand carefully, tight enough to control the bleeding, loose enough to keep using it. Behind me, my mother was still waiting, still expecting a fight, still expecting tears, still expecting resistance. Instead, I stood up. The room seemed confused by my lack of reaction. Evelyn blinked. Julian shifted awkwardly. Nobody knew what to do when I refused to follow the script. I picked up Scout's leash. Then I crouched beside him again. Heel. The command came out soft. Scout's ears moved immediately. Training, habit, trust. He pushed himself up. His legs trembled. For a second, I thought he might fall. Then he steadied himself beside me. Good boy. Always a good boy, even after everything, especially after everything. I reached down and adjusted his collar. My fingers brushed against the cut rope still attached to it. A reminder. A simple piece of nylon worth maybe $3. And somehow it told me more about my family than 35 years of conversations ever had. I straightened up. Then I buttoned the front of my dress uniform jacket. One button, then another, then the last. The motion felt automatic. Military habits survive almost anything. I glanced toward the kitchen window. Outside, donors continued drinking wine. Servers moved between tables. Campaign banners fluttered in the afternoon heat. The entire event looked polished and successful. A carefully manufactured image. My mother had spent months building it. Julian had attached his business future to it. Dozens of people had invested money in it, and none of them knew the foundation underneath was rotten. Not yet. Evelyn finally broke the silence. What are you doing? I finished adjusting my jacket sleeves. Then I looked directly at her. For the first time all afternoon, there was no anger left in me. That surprised even me. The anger had burned itself out. What remained was clarity. I understood something now that I should have understood years ago. My mother didn't see me, not really. Julian didn't either. To them, I wasn't a daughter. I wasn't a sister. I wasn't a veteran. I wasn't a person with injuries, struggles, or limits. I was useful, or inconvenient. Those were the only two categories that mattered. Today, I had become inconvenient. Scout had become inconvenient. And they were perfectly willing to sacrifice both of us to protect their plans. The realization should have hurt. Instead, it felt like finally reading a document everyone else had already signed. No surprises. Just confirmation. I slipped the leash into my left hand. Then I met Evelyn Dulles' eyes. I'll go out there. The words caught both of them off guard. Julian looked up immediately. Evelyn blinked twice. What? I said I'll go out there. For the first time all afternoon, a smile started returning to her face. Not a real smile. The campaign smile. The one she used whenever she thought she had won. Relief flooded across her features. I could practically see the calculations happening behind her eyes. Crisis contained, donors protected, photos saved. Campaign back on track. She thought the storm had passed. She had no idea it was just changing direction. I reached down and gave Scout a gentle scratch behind the ear. Then I looked back at my mother. My voice came out calm enough to make even me uncomfortable, completely flat, completely steady, completely empty. I'll go out there. A pause. Then I added the last sentence. Let's finish the party. Evelyn smiled, Julian exhaled, and both of them made the same mistake at exactly the same moment. They thought my calmness meant surrender. That misunderstanding bought me exactly what I needed. Time. Evelyn immediately transformed back into her campaign version of herself. The anger vanished. The smile returned. By the time we stepped onto the patio, nobody would have guessed she had slapped her daughter less than 10 minutes earlier. I walked beside Scout at a slow pace. Heel. The command barely left my mouth before he settled perfectly at my side. His paws were still injured, his movements were slower than normal. But his training remained intact. Unlike some people in my family, the gala had grown larger while we were inside. More vehicles lined the street. More donors filled the lawn. Campaign volunteers moved quickly between tables carrying drinks and brochures. Near the stage, a large banner displayed my mother's campaign slogan, Surface, Integrity. I almost admired the confidence it took to print all 3 words at once. Scout stayed close as we moved through the crowd. A few guests noticed the bandage wrapped around my hand. Most chose not to ask questions. That didn't surprise me. People attend political fundraisers to avoid uncomfortable conversations, not create them. One donor smiled nervously. "Everything okay, Master Sergeant?" I looked at the blood beginning to soak through the towel. "Depends who you ask." Before he could respond, Evelyn appeared beside me. Her hand settled lightly against my arm. To anyone watching, it looked affectionate. To me, it felt like handcuffs. "There she is," Evelyn announced brightly. "My daughter always has a sense of humor." The donor laughed politely. Of course he did. Nobody wants to become the problem at somebody else's fundraiser. I kept walking. Across the lawn, Julian was already back to networking. The remarkable thing about my brother was how quickly he could recover from moral failure if money was involved. 20 minutes earlier, he had stood in a kitchen, staring at the floor, while a heat-injured dog struggled to breathe. Now he was discussing development opportunities with a county commissioner. Life moves fast when your conscience travels light. I stopped near the edge of the patio. Scout lowered himself carefully onto the grass beside my chair. I checked his breathing again. Better. Still not normal. Better. That was enough to keep me standing. The atmosphere around the event shifted suddenly. Not dramatically, subtly, like a ripple moving through water. People began checking their phones. Volunteers straightened their jackets. Campaign staff moved toward the driveway. Conversations became shorter. Excitement spread across the lawn. The guest of honor had arrived, General Harrison Caldwell. Even before I saw him, I knew what his presence meant. My mother had spent months trying to secure his attendance. A sitting base commander appearing at her fundraiser wasn't just symbolic. It was political gold. Veterans respected him. Military families respected him. Community leaders respected him. Unlike most public figures, he had actually earned the respect he received. That made him dangerous. People who earn authority tend to recognize when others are pretending. Evelyn practically floated toward the entrance path. I watched her abandon one conversation after another. A councilman got ignored. A donor got ignored. A local television reporter got ignored. Nothing mattered now except the general. Julian appeared beside her moments later. The 2 of them looked like investors waiting for a stock price to update. Then the crowd parted. General Caldwell entered the lawn. Even out of uniform, he carried himself like a soldier. Tall, straight-backed, alert. The kind of presence that doesn't need introductions. Several guests moved toward him immediately. He greeted them politely, briefly, never stopping, scanning, observing, assessing, the same way experienced military leaders always do. My mother intercepted him halfway across the patio. "Evelyn Thorne," she said brightly, extending both hands. "General Caldwell, we're honored." She never finished, because something strange happened. He wasn't looking at her, not really. His attention moved past her almost immediately. The general's eyes continued scanning the crowd. Then they stopped, on me. More specifically, on my right hand. The white towel wrapped around it was no longer completely white. A small stain of dried blood had begun showing through. His gaze narrowed, then moved lower, to Scout. The Belgian Malinois sitting beside my chair, the injured paws. The exhaustion, the posture. Recognition flashed across his face instantly. Not uncertainty, recognition. The kind that arrives when you've seen something important before. My mother noticed the shift too. I watched panic flicker behind her smile. Just for a second. Then she reacted. She stepped sideways, subtle, calculated, positioning herself between us, blocking his line of sight. It might have worked on a politician. Politicians tend to look where they're guided. Soldiers don't. General Caldwell simply adjusted his path. One step left, then another. His focus never left Scout, or me. My mother moved again, still smiling, still talking, still attempting to control the interaction. "General, I'd love to introduce you to several key supporters." Nothing. He barely acknowledged her. The crowd started noticing. People always notice when power changes direction. Conversation slowed. Several guests turned toward us. Julian stopped talking mid-sentence. Even the photographer lowered his camera. General Caldwell reached my mother's outstretched hand, then walked straight past it. The movement was polite, effortless, devastating. Evelyn remained frozen in place with her hand hanging awkwardly in the air. The expression on her face almost made me feel sorry for her. Almost. The general continued toward me, toward Scout, toward the truth none of them realized was about to become public. By the time he stopped in front of us, the entire patio had fallen silent. And for the first time all evening, my mother looked genuinely afraid. General Caldwell stopped directly in front of me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he looked at my face, the faint red mark from the slap, the blood-stained bandage wrapped around my hand, the exhaustion I probably wasn't hiding as well as I thought. His expression hardened, not with anger, with concern, the kind real leaders carry when they see one of their people hurt. Then he did something nobody on that patio expected. He came to attention and saluted. The entire crowd froze. I returned the salute automatically. 12 years in uniform makes certain reactions permanent. The general lowered his hand. Master Sergeant Thorne. Sir. His eyes shifted downward toward Scout. Immediately, he crouched beside him, not carefully, not reluctantly, without hesitation. One of the most powerful people on the property dropped to one knee in the grass beside an injured dog. That alone told everyone paying attention exactly who he was. Scout recognized him. His tail moved once, a weak thump against the ground. General Caldwell examined the cuts on his paws. The dried blood, the raw skin, the signs of heat exposure. The expression on his face darkened with every second. Around us, conversations disappeared completely. Nobody was eating, nobody was drinking, nobody was networking. Dozens of wealthy donors stood silently watching a decorated military commander inspect a wounded dog. My mother looked like she wanted to interrupt. She didn't dare. The general finally stood, slowly, carefully. Then he looked directly at me. How long was he exposed? The question was simple. I answered honestly. I don't know exactly, sir. His jaw tightened. That answer told him everything. He turned. His gaze swept across the crowd, then landed on the microphone sitting at the podium. The microphone my mother had prepared for her campaign speech. Without asking permission, he walked over and picked it up. The movement sent visible panic through Evelyn. She took one quick step forward, then stopped herself. The general faced the audience. Several campaign volunteers looked confused. A few donors glanced toward my mother for guidance. Nobody received any. Good evening. His voice carried effortlessly across the lawn. Years of command had trained him for that. No shouting required. The crowd became even quieter. I apologize for interrupting tonight's program. A pause. I have a question before this event continues. Every eye on the property locked onto him. He gestured toward Scout, the injured Belgian Malinois lying beside my chair. Many of you may not know who that dog is. Nobody moved, nobody spoke. The general continued. His name is Scout. A few people nodded politely, still confused. Then everything changed. Scout is a retired military working dog. Several guests straightened immediately. He completed multiple deployments overseas. Another pause. He received commendations that most soldiers never earn. The crowd exchanged uncertain looks. My mother's smile was completely gone now. The general wasn't finished. Years ago, in Kandahar province, Scout detected 3 separate improvised explosive devices during a convoy operation. The silence became absolute. He prevented multiple casualties. Another pause. He saved my life. You could almost hear the collective intake of breath. Several donors stared at Scout differently now, not as a dog, as a veteran, as someone who had served. The general pointed toward me. And the soldier responsible for handling him during those deployments was Master Sergeant Valerie Thorne. More heads turned, more faces changed. Recognition spread across the crowd. Not political recognition. Respect. Real respect. The kind that can't be purchased through campaign donations. The general looked at me, then back at the audience. When an explosion occurred during one operation, Master Sergeant Thorne entered the danger zone and pulled Scout clear of the blast radius. A few guests visibly reacted. One woman lowered her wine glass. Another man removed his sunglasses. Nobody looked comfortable anymore. Good, they shouldn't. The general's eyes shifted toward Evelyn. The temperature of the entire event seemed to drop. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Which brings me to my question. The pause stretched. His gaze moved from Scout's paws to my bandaged hand, then back to my mother. The disgust on his face was impossible to miss. Why is this hero's dog bleeding? Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. And why is Master Sergeant Thorne injured? The words landed like artillery. Direct, accurate, impossible to ignore. My mother opened her mouth. Nothing came out. For the first time in her life, she didn't have a prepared answer. Then she tried anyway. General, I think there's been a misunderstanding, of course. There was always a misunderstanding. Never a mistake, never accountability, just misunderstandings. She forced a nervous laugh. Scout accidentally got into an area he wasn't supposed to be. I almost admired the speed of the lie. Almost. He became distressed. Another lie. We were trying to manage the situation. A third lie. The crowd wasn't buying it. Not anymore. You could see it happening. The same donors who had applauded her speeches 30 minutes earlier were now watching her the way people watch a witness change testimony. General Caldwell said nothing. He simply looked at her, and somehow that made things worse. The silence invited truth, so I stood up. My chair scraped softly against the patio. Every head turned. The microphone remained in the general's hand. He offered it to me immediately. No hesitation, no questions, just trust. I accepted it. The metal felt cool against my palm. I looked across the lawn, at the donors, the investors, the reporters, the volunteers. At Julian standing motionless near the stage. At my mother frozen beside her campaign banner. Then I spoke. Calmly, clearly, without anger, without drama, without exaggeration. Just the truth. My mother locked this decorated veteran in a 100-degree garage to make sure her campaign photos looked perfect. Nobody moved. The words settled over the crowd like concrete. I continued. Scout was tied inside. Silence. He scratched his paws bloody trying to escape. Silence. I found him suffering from heat exposure. Silence. I had to break the garage window to get him out. Somewhere near the front row, somebody quietly said, "My God." I looked at my mother, then at Julian, then back at the crowd, and I delivered the final piece. The investor she was trying to impress didn't like large dogs. The silence that followed was no longer confusion, it was judgment. And for the first time all evening, my mother's carefully constructed world began to collapse in public. Not with shouting, not with accusations, not with some dramatic scene from a television show. The collapse arrived through silence. The kind of silence money can't fix. The kind that appears when respect leaves a room. Nobody rushed to defend Evelyn. Nobody stepped forward to explain. Nobody offered alternative interpretations. The donors simply stood there, thinking, watching, recalculating everything they thought they knew about her. General Caldwell looked at me for a moment, then at Scout, then back toward the crowd. Slowly he placed the microphone onto the podium. The small sound echoed across the patio. Click. Nobody spoke. Finally, the general broke the silence. I don't endorse people who abuse our lifelines. His voice carried effortlessly across the lawn. No anger, no theatrics. Just certainty. He turned toward Evelyn. I especially don't endorse people who do it for political convenience. The words landed harder than any speech could have. My mother looked like she wanted to argue, wanted to explain, wanted to regain control. For perhaps the first time in her entire campaign, nobody cared what she had to say. General Caldwell nodded once in my direction, then once toward Scout, a soldier's acknowledgement, simple, respectful, enough. Without another word, he walked toward the driveway. And just like that, the most important endorsement of Evelyn Thorne's political career disappeared. The crowd watched him leave. For several seconds, nobody moved. Then something remarkable happened. One donor quietly set down his champagne glass. A woman near the front row lowered her campaign brochure onto a table. A local business owner shook his head and followed the general. Then another, then another. No announcements, no confrontation, just choices. One person after another deciding they wanted no part of what they had just witnessed. The exodus spread across the property. Within minutes, the lawn that had seemed so important earlier looked noticeably smaller. Conversations ended. Business cards disappeared back into pockets. Handshakes were abandoned halfway through introductions. People began heading toward the valet station. Campaign volunteers exchanged nervous looks. Several didn't know whether to keep working or go home. Honestly, I felt bad for them. Most were probably college students trying to earn experience. They had signed up for politics, not whatever this had become. Across the lawn, I spotted Julian. His face had gone completely pale. A developer who had been speaking with him earlier was already walking away. Another investor followed, then another. Nobody argued, nobody threatened him, nobody needed to. Large projects depend on trust. and trust leaves much faster than money arrives. I watched Julian pull out his phone, one call, then another. Neither lasted long. His future was unraveling in real time, not because of me, because of choices. That distinction mattered. People often confuse consequences with revenge. They aren't the same thing. I never exposed a lie, I simply stopped protecting one. Near the stage, my mother remained frozen. The campaign banner behind her fluttered gently in the evening breeze. Surface. Integrity. Community. The words looked almost funny now. Not because they were bad values, because she had spent years treating them like marketing slogans instead of principles. Eventually, Evelyn lowered herself into a patio chair. The movement looked strange, smaller somehow. For years, she had seemed larger than life. The center of every room, the source of every decision, the person everyone adjusted around. Now she looked like an exhausted woman sitting alone beside a half-empty fundraiser. No audience, no applause, no control. I expected to feel satisfied, maybe even triumphant. Instead, I felt tired, very tired. 35 years is a long time to carry expectations that never get met. At some point, you stop being angry. You just get honest. Scout nudged my hand. I looked down. His breathing had improved again. The cooling towels had helped. The shade had helped. Being out of that garage had helped most of all. I crouched beside him. "You ready to get out of here?" His ears lifted, a much better sign. His tail gave a small wag. Good enough. I reached for his leash. Nobody stopped me. Nobody asked me to stay. Nobody asked me for another statement. The story was already over. People simply hadn't realized it yet. Scout rose carefully and moved into position beside me. Heel. Immediately. Always. Together we started walking, past the abandoned tables, past the campaign signs, past the donors heading toward their cars, past the life my mother had spent years trying to build. I didn't look back, not because I was trying to make a point, because there was nothing left worth seeing. The evening air felt cooler now. The sun had begun slipping lower beyond the trees. For the first time all day, I could breathe without feeling pressure in my chest. The front gate stood open. Scout and I crossed through it side by side. The neighborhood beyond looked completely ordinary. Kids riding bicycles, a man walking his Labrador, someone grilling dinner a few houses away. Normal life, real life. The kind that keeps moving whether a campaign survives or not. I paused at the sidewalk and looked down at Scout. Years earlier, people had called me brave for serving overseas. The truth was simpler. Courage isn't usually found in explosions or uniforms. Sometimes it's found in smaller moments. Walking away, setting a boundary, telling the truth when keeping quiet would be easier, letting go of people who only love the version of you that benefits them. I scratched behind Scout's ear. He leaned gently into my hand, and standing there beside the one creature who had never once asked me to become someone else, I finally understood something my family never did. Dignity isn't winning an argument. It isn't proving your relatives wrong. It isn't watching people get punished. Real peace begins the moment you realize you no longer need their permission to leave. So I kept walking. And this time, I didn't look back. The veterinarian finally smiled for the first time since we arrived. His temperature is coming down. I hadn't realized how tightly I was gripping the armrest until that moment. I looked through the glass partition into the treatment area where Scout was resting on a cooling mat. An IV line ran into his front leg. His breathing looked normal again. Not perfect, but normal. For the first time all day, I felt my shoulders relax. The emergency clinic was quiet compared to the fundraiser. No campaign signs, no speeches, no donors, no people pretending to care. Just veterinarians, technicians, worried pet owners, and a dog who had narrowly avoided a disaster. Funny how honesty tends to live in ordinary places. I sat there for a long time watching Scout sleep. And for the first time since leaving my mother's house, I wasn't thinking about Evelyn. I wasn't thinking about Julian. I wasn't thinking about the campaign. I was thinking about loyalty. Most people use that word incorrectly. I know I did. For years, I thought loyalty meant staying. Staying when people treated you badly. Staying when they dismissed your struggles. Staying when they made it clear your feelings ranked somewhere below their convenience. I thought that was what good daughters did. I thought endurance was proof of love. I thought sacrifice automatically made someone honorable. Turns out those things aren't always the same. One of the strangest lessons I learned came from a dog. Scout never demanded anything from me. He didn't care about my military rank. He didn't care about my income. He didn't care whether I impressed anyone. When PTSD hit me hard, he stayed. When nightmares woke me up at 3 in the morning, he stayed. When therapy sessions left me exhausted and angry and emotionally drained, he stayed. Not because he needed something, because that's what loyalty actually looks like. It's steady, it's honest. It doesn't disappear when circumstances become inconvenient. My family taught me a different version, a dangerous version. The kind many people watching this story may recognize. The idea that family automatically deserves unlimited access to your life. The idea that saying no is selfish. The idea that protecting yourself is somehow betrayal. I believed that for years. A lot of people do. Maybe some of you are living that reality right now. Maybe it's a parent, maybe it's a spouse, maybe it's a sibling. Maybe it's a friend who only calls when they need help. The details change. The pattern stays the same. You keep giving, they keep taking, and eventually you convince yourself that's normal. The hardest part is that toxic relationships rarely start with cruelty. They start with small compromises, small excuses, small explanations. You tell yourself they're stressed. You tell yourself they didn't mean it. You tell yourself things will improve. Then, one day you wake up and realize you've spent years making excuses for behavior you would never accept from a stranger. That realization hurts, but it also sets you free. Looking back now, the garage wasn't the real problem. The garage was the symptom. The real problem was a system that had existed in my family for decades. A system where appearances mattered more than people. A system where usefulness determined value. A system where love was often conditional. The garage simply exposed it. One of the veterinary technicians walked into the waiting room carrying a clipboard. "He's asking for you." I smiled. Scout always had excellent timing. When I entered the treatment room, he lifted his head immediately, his ears perked up, his tail tapped against the floor, just enough to let me know he was still himself. I sat beside him. He leaned against my leg. Simple, quiet, enough. The technician laughed. "I think you're his favorite person." I scratched behind Scout's ear. "I hope so. I've invested a lot of snacks into this relationship." She laughed and left us alone. For a while, neither of us did much. And honestly, that's another lesson people overlook. Healthy relationships don't require constant performance. You don't have to earn your place every day. You don't have to prove your worth every hour. You don't have to keep auditioning for acceptance. You're simply allowed to exist. That sounds obvious. But many people spend their entire lives around individuals who make it feel impossible. If there's one thing I hope people take away from my story, it's this. Loyalty should never require you to surrender your dignity. Love should never require you to abandon your reality. And respect should never disappear the moment you become inconvenient. If someone only values you when you're useful, they're not attached to you. They're attached to your usefulness. Those are very different things. I looked down at Scout. He was already drifting back to sleep. The same dog who had pulled me through panic attacks. The same dog who had nearly died because someone viewed him as a problem. The same dog who never once asked me to become someone else. And sitting there beside him in a quiet veterinary clinic, miles away from campaign speeches and political theater, I felt something unexpected. Not victory, not revenge, relief. Because for the first time in a very long time, I wasn't fighting to keep a place in someone's life. I was finally protecting my place in my own. I laughed when the veterinarian handed me the discharge paperwork. Not because anything was funny, because the first item on the recovery instructions said, "Monitor for signs of stress." I looked at Scout. Then I looked at myself. If there had been a loyalty rewards program for stress, we both would have qualified for lifetime platinum status. The veterinarian smiled politely. I don't think she got the joke. That's probably for the best. A few days passed after the fundraiser. Then a week. The calls started almost immediately. Reporters, campaign volunteers, people who had attended the event, people who had heard about the event, even a few people who somehow too knew someone who had attended the event. Apparently, public humiliation travels faster than broadband internet. I ignored most of it, not because I was hiding, because I was tired. When you've spent years being treated like a supporting character in somebody else's story, eventually you stop feeling responsible for managing everyone's reactions. One afternoon, while Scout slept beside the couch, I found myself thinking about something that had bothered me for years. Not the slap, not the garage, not even the fundraiser. Something much bigger. Growing up, I believed dangerous people were easy to identify. Movies teach us that. Television teaches us that. The villain is loud, aggressive, threatening, obvious. Real life is rarely that convenient. Some of the most damaging people you'll ever meet are perfectly pleasant. They smile, they volunteer, they remember birthdays, they donate to charities. They know exactly which words make them look good in public. The damage happens somewhere else. Behind closed doors. In private conversations. In small decisions nobody notices. My mother rarely screamed. Honestly, she didn't need to. She had discovered something much more effective: control. The ability to make other people question themselves. The ability to make you feel guilty for having needs. The ability to convince you that your boundaries were the actual problem. Looking back, I can see the pattern clearly. But when you're living inside the pattern, it feels normal. That's the dangerous part. Nobody wakes up one morning and says, "I'd like to spend the next 20 years being emotionally manipulated." It happens gradually, one compromise at a time, one excuse at a time, one justification at a time, until eventually you're carrying responsibilities that were never yours to begin with. My brother operated differently. Julian wasn't controlling, he was convenient. Everything in his life revolved around convenience. If helping you was convenient, he'd help. If supporting you was convenient, he'd support. If standing up for you cost him something, suddenly the conversation became complicated. A lot of people know someone like that. Maybe you work with them. Maybe you're related to them. Maybe you married them. They aren't cruel enough to feel like villains. They're just absent whenever character becomes expensive. That's exactly why they're dangerous. The most destructive people aren't always the ones who attack you. Sometimes they're the ones who quietly step aside while somebody else does. I remembered the kitchen, the moment after my mother slapped me, Julian standing there, looking at the floor, saying nothing. People often ask why silence hurts so much. The answer is simple: because silence makes a choice. Silence decides who matters. Silence decides what behavior is acceptable. Silence decides whose pain deserves attention. That day, Julian made his choice, not by speaking, by refusing to. Scout lifted his head and looked at me. The movement interrupted my thoughts. I reached down and scratched behind his ear. He immediately leaned into my hand. Simple, honest, no hidden agenda. One of the things PTSD teaches you is that your nervous system eventually becomes very good at detecting threats. Unfortunately, it doesn't always tell you what kind. Most people imagine danger as something dramatic: a car accident, an explosion, a violent confrontation. But emotional danger usually looks ordinary. It looks like someone constantly dismissing your reality. It looks like someone making every conversation about themselves. It looks like someone treating your boundaries as personal attacks. It looks like someone expecting endless understanding while offering none. If you're watching this and wondering whether a relationship in your life might be unhealthy, ask yourself a simple question. How do you feel after spending time with that person? Not during, after. Do you feel respected or exhausted? Do you feel understood or managed? Do you feel valued or used? The answers are usually sitting right in front of us. We just don't like what they say. The biggest turning point in my story wasn't the fundraiser. It wasn't the general. It wasn't even the public exposure. The real turning point happened in that kitchen. The moment I stopped trying to convince people to care. That's what changed everything. For years, I kept presenting evidence, explaining my PTSD, explaining Scout's role, explaining my boundaries, explaining my feelings, explaining reality itself, as if the right explanation would finally unlock empathy. It never did, because understanding was never the problem. They understood perfectly. They simply didn't care enough to change. That realization sounds depressing. Oddly enough, it was liberating. Because once you accept that some people don't want to understand you, you stop wasting energy trying to earn something they were never willing to give. Respect, compassion, basic human consideration. Those things should not require a sales presentation. I looked down at Scout again. He had already fallen asleep, comfortable, safe, at peace. And sitting there in the quiet living room, I realized something that took me 35 years to learn. Not every relationship deserves another chance. Not every bridge needs rebuilding. And sometimes the healthiest thing you can do is stop standing in front of a locked door, hoping the people inside suddenly become different. Sometimes you simply turn around and keep walking. A few weeks after the fundraiser, I was sitting on a park bench watching Scout chase a tennis ball he had absolutely no intention of returning. If you've never owned a Belgian Malinois, let me save you some time. They are incredibly intelligent. until a tennis ball becomes involved. They're basically furry criminals. Scout trotted 20 yards away, grabbed the ball, and immediately began negotiating new terms for its return. I laughed. A real laugh this time. The kind that shows up unexpectedly. The kind I hadn't heard from myself in a while. Life looked surprisingly normal. That was probably the biggest surprise of all. The campaign had collapsed. Julian's development project was struggling. My mother's name had become a local cautionary tale among people who followed city politics. And yet, the sun still came up. Dogs still chased tennis balls. People still went to work. Life continued. For years, I had secretly believed that major emotional events would feel dramatic forever. That there would be some permanent soundtrack playing in the background. Some giant emotional scarlet letter attached to every day afterward. Reality turned out to be much quieter. Healing usually is. Most mornings, I woke up, made coffee, fed Scout, went to therapy, answered emails, lived my life. Nothing cinematic, nothing extraordinary, just peace. And after everything that happened, peace felt extraordinary enough. My phone buzzed. I didn't need to look. I already knew who it was. My mother had called 19 times that week. Not 18, not 20, 19. Yes, I counted. PTSD comes with many talents. Some more useful than others. The voicemail notifications piled up. Then the text messages started. Then the emails. At first, she wanted to explain. Then she wanted to justify. Then she wanted forgiveness. Eventually, she wanted things to go back to normal. That's usually how it works. People often miss the version of you that tolerated behavior you no longer accept. The difficult part is understanding what they're actually mourning. It usually isn't the relationship. It's the access. There is a difference. One afternoon, I finally listened to a voicemail. Just one, 3 minutes of excuses. 3 minutes of explanations. 3 minutes describing how difficult the situation had been for her. Not one sentence asking how Scout was doing. Not one sentence asking how I was doing. Not one sentence taking responsibility. By the end of the message, I felt strangely relieved. Not angry, relieved. Because sometimes people answer questions you've been carrying for years. Without realizing it, I deleted the voicemail. Then I took Scout for a walk. That felt healthier. One thing I want people watching this story to understand is that freedom rarely arrives the way we imagine. Most of us spend years waiting for something. An apology, validation, recognition, justice, closure. We convince ourselves that peace will arrive after somebody finally admits they were wrong, after somebody finally appreciates us, after somebody finally changes. The problem is that your future becomes dependent on someone else's decision. That's a dangerous place to leave your happiness. I spent years waiting for my family to understand me, waiting for them to respect my boundaries, waiting for them to acknowledge my service, waiting for them to see Scout the way I saw him. I wasn't waiting for a day. I was waiting for permission. Permission to feel valued. Permission to feel respected. Permission to believe I mattered. The hardest lesson of my adult life was realizing nobody else can give you that. Not your parents, not your spouse, not your boss, not your children, not your friends, and definitely not strangers on the internet. Your value cannot depend on somebody else's approval, because approval can disappear. Public opinion changes. Relationships change. Circumstances change. If your worth depends on external validation, you're handing strangers the keys to your emotional house. That's a risky investment. Scout finally returned with the tennis ball. For approximately 3 seconds, then he stole it again. I shook my head. You're lucky you're cute. His tail wagged, completely unbothered. A useful life skill, honestly. Looking back now, I don't think the most important moment happened at the fundraiser. It wasn't General Caldwell exposing the truth. It wasn't the donors leaving. It wasn't my mother's campaign collapsing. Those moments mattered, but they weren't the most important. The most important moment happened at the gate. The moment Scout and I walked away. Not because we won, because we stopped participating. People think freedom comes from defeating something. Sometimes freedom comes from leaving it behind. There are people watching this right now who are carrying relationships that drain them. People who spend every holiday anxious, every phone call stressed, every family gathering exhausted. People who keep sacrificing their peace because they believe that's what good people do. I want to tell you something I wish someone had told me years ago. Protecting your mental health is not selfish. Setting boundaries is not cruel. Walking away from unhealthy behavior is not weakness. And choosing peace over constant conflict does not mean you've failed. Sometimes it means you've finally learned. Today, Scout is healthy. I'm still in therapy. Life isn't perfect. Some scars never completely disappear. But perfection was never the goal. Peace was. And peace arrived the moment I stopped asking difficult people for things they were never willing to give. As the sun started setting behind the trees, Scout dropped the tennis ball at my feet. Finally, a small miracle. I picked it up and smiled, because the truth is, the day I walked out of that gate wasn't the day my family lost me. It was the day I stopped losing myself. If that lesson can help even one person listening to this story, then everything that happened was worth telling.